Hey guys, Frosty Knives here, back with another book review. And last week, on April 5th, 2024, that was the 50th anniversary of a debut novel that launched one of the most historical careers in horror fiction. And that novel was Stephen King's Carrie. Stephen King's Carrie turned 50. Can you believe that? It's been around for half a century. Just like me. Can't believe either things are true. But here we are. And I started to think, I have never read nor reviewed Carrie. As much as that is hard to believe, that was a book of his that I never read because I watched the movie and I knew the story. And I didn't think the book was going to be any different. So I thought, what better time to read and review this debut novel than on its 50th anniversary year. So that's what we're going to do today. Today we're going to be talking about Stephen King's Carrie. Published in 1974. This is the original hardcover edition, first edition, with the original cover of Carrie. And as you can see, big title in big letters, Stephen King's name in small letters. Eventually, as he becomes the king of horror, that will flip, and his name will become the biggest thing on the title. But here we are, a nice little 200-page debut novel from an then unknown horror writer. Let me just take a moment to read from the back blurb. In this, his first novel, Stephen King reveals a New England town, a girl, and a secret older than history. His chilling tale takes hold of the reader. From the first bizarre incident to the last blossoming terror, Mr. King is a school teacher who lives in Maine with his wife and 2 children. And there is a picture of Mr. King. Little did they know what this would start rolling. So let's talk about it. I'm not going to tell you the story because it's been 50 years and we all know the story. And the movie didn't really deviate much from the book. Same things happened. We have Carrie White, a teenager, telekinetic powers, bullied at school. She's got an overbearing mother, religious fanatic, lots of religious abuse going on at the home. She gets her first period in school. There's the infamous shower scene, yada, yada. Things happen, bullying's happen. We get to the prom. We get to the bucket of blood. We get to the destruction, and it's pretty much what you know happens in the movie. So we're not going to really talk about the story, but what we are going to talk about is a little bit about what I think of Carrie, the book, and its mark on the horror genre, and did it do its job as a debut novel, and why did it do its job as a debut novel, right? What made Carrie so good and important that it launched a mega career? 1974. Boy, that was a time in the horror genre where we, horror fans, horror fiction, horror movies, we were fascinated with children, evil children, right? Or children where either doing evil things or where evil things were happening to children. This started back, Village of the Damned was one of the early ones that I can remember about evil children. And that's such an iconic idea because children in fiction and horror fiction and whatnot are usually the picture of innocence, right? That's the last bastion of innocence. And when you corrupt innocence, or when innocence becomes evil, then that really resonates with people. So Before Carrie, in 1968, there was Rosemary's Baby. Rosemary's Baby was about Rosemary who had a child. There was some satanic cultists involved. They wanted to use Rosemary's Baby as for a ritual. It's been a long time since I've read and or watched the book or watched the movie. But that's what Rosemary's Baby was about. There was some supernatural religious evil coming after her child. And in 1970, we get The Exorcist. Reagan, the story of Reagan, possessed by the demon Pazuzu. All the evil things and terrible things that the demon made Reagan do in the book. We had that fascinating novel and movie that was really just shaking the foundation of what it meant to be a horror movie at that time. And 1974 comes out, we have Carrie. And then 1976 came out, we had The Omen, right? We had Damien and The Omen and the birth of the Antichrist and child that's evil. So this was a time period where they were exploring children that were either doing evil things and having evil things done to them. And so you had a bad child, a bad seed, or a child of some sort, and then you had a horror, a supernatural horror, a religious horror that was affecting the child, and then you had a story, right? Your Rosemary's Baby, you had the baby, you had the satanic cultists, you had your religious horror. The Exorcist, you had Reagan, young child, you had your possession, so religious horror. Damien, young child, was the Antichrist. There's your religious horror. And just like that, Carrie, it fits nicely into this mold of a child, picture of innocence, who has some powers, who has telekinetic powers, and then the evil of the religious abuse that was going on by her mother. The bullying that was going on by the school children. So you had the child, and then you had the supernatural or evil horror element that was going on with that. So this fit right into the time period of horror. What it did differently, unlike those other examples, unlike Rosemary's Baby or The Exorcist, those were stories that were told as a story, right? It had a beginning, a middle, and an end. It was kind of compact. This was a fictional story about an incident that was happening to a child and her family and how that incident was resolved. Carrie was written a little differently. Carrie was written almost as a case study, right? Because we had the story of Carrie, but it was told to us as if it had already happened. We have interviews. The book is weaved with interviews, snippets from books, snippets from case studies, interviews with the survivors, interviews with doctors, interviews with police officers who investigated the incident. It was almost presented to us as this has already happened. We're hearing the story from the survivors. And then we get to see the firsthand account of what Carrie actually did in the book. So that was different, right? Much like the Amityville Horror, which was presented to us as, hey, this is something that really happened. So this is a dramatic reenactment of what happened in the house in Amityville. Carrie was presented the same way. That this is something that possibly could happen, did happen, might happen. And we're looking at it from scientific angles, from legal angles, from all kinds of angles as we try to dissect this story. That was unique. That was new. That was not happening at this time period. And that kind of storytelling will become synonymous with the way King tells stories. He loves to blur the line between fiction and reality. He loves to talk about what if this could actually happen and how would we actually respond. Some people like that kind of writing. Some people don't. I do because I'm used to it, but I can understand how some people wouldn't like that kind of back and forth type of storytelling. You also have to remember that Carrie started out as a novella, not a novel. So I'm thinking that maybe he used this extraneous material to sort of fill out the book a little bit to make it to novel length. But again, this is sort of this is an instance where your mileage may vary. You may like it, or you may not like it. That type of storytelling may be your cup of tea, or it may not. But it was unique at the time, 1974. People weren't telling stories like that. So that was different. That's one of the things that made Carrie stand out, I think, from the others. The other thing, one of the other things that stood out, I think that made Carrie stand out, was its scope, right? In all the other instances of books, you had a small cast of characters. The horror was insulated. The rest of the world didn't really know what was going on. So unless you were in the circle, unless you were in Reagan's circle, you wouldn't know what was going on with her and her exorcism. Very small circle, very insulated, very private. They kept it under wraps. They kept it in the shadows. They kept it out of the limelight. So we were looking at a microcosm of horror. In Carrie, King blew that microcosm wide open. Because the horror didn't just affect Carrie. It affected her mother. It affected the school, the kids in school. It affected the whole town. She took the horror and she brought it to everybody. She killed her mom. She burned down the high school. She blew up the gas stations. She torched half the town. She tore down all the power lines. She broke the water mains. She turned on the gas in the town. The body count in Carrie was phenomenal. It was like 400, 500 people dead, right? So the scope of the horror, the scope of the brutality was brought out to everybody. Everybody could see what was going on with Carrie. Town folk was running for their lives. This was no longer a microcosm. This was no longer an isolated incident between a couple of people. She didn't just go after her mom and the few people that did the blood prank. She went after everybody. She took it out of the darkness and she torched the whole town. So the scope was phenomenal. People were probably reading this going, my God, she's let loose upon this whole town. And that's something else that Stephen King is known for. That's something else that he will carry on with him in other books as well. Stephen King loves torching things. He loves destroying things. He loves blowing things up, right? He blew up the town in Carrie. The entire town of Salem's Lot got taken over by vampires. Entire town. He blew up Castle Rock and Needful Things. He mostly destroyed Derry and It. He destroyed the whole world in The Stand. So, Stephen King likes taking a horror and blowing it up to such a scope that it encompasses that the fallout is this giant ring of fallout. Like nobody, and it really gives you the impression that nobody's safe. No one's safe. No one's safe in a Stephen King novel. So now we have this anxiety of, oh my God, who's going to survive and who's not going to survive? So he really blew the doors wide open on the scope of things. And he really made it so that you weren't sure who was going to live or die. Because even in some of his stories, the hero dies. Carrie died. Carrie's not the villain of this story. Carrie's not the monster. Everybody else is the monster. Carrie's the anti-hero. And she dies. So not even the main character is safe in Stephen King books. So that's one thing he changed, was his scope of brutality. Another thing that happens in the book, and this also happens in a lot of his other books, something else that carries over, is the use of power and how it affects people, right? So, Carrie White has telekinetic power, and she becomes this walking bomb. She's this powerful thing, right? That nobody can stop. So when you write a story like that, you have to think, how are we going to resolve it? How is this going to end, right? How is something this powerful? How can it be stopped? Who's going to stop it? Can it be stopped? And so he writes into the book that the power that Carrie uses is powerful, but it's also a power that consumes her. Carrie is consumed by her own power. She's killed by her own power. Her power is so strong that it eventually destroys her physically. She dies from the exertion of using these powers. You may call that a MacGuffin. You may call that, well, that's kind of cheating because, how else would we be able to stop something so powerful? But really, he likes to explore the idea of, with power, there's a price. Great power, great price. The price of Carrie's telekinetic powers is her own life. She could use it sparingly if she wanted to, but she went whole hog, and that consumed her. So she was done in by the full force of her own powers. And that's another theme that Stephen King carries along in some of the books, right? Other books. The Dead Zone. Johnny Smith. Every time Johnny Smith had a psychic blast or used his psychic powers, he would get pinprick hemorrhages in his brain. And his power would eventually kill him. Which is why he did what he did at the end of the book, trying to kill Greg Stilson, because he figured, I'm going to die from this, so I can either die alone at home or I can try to change the world. And so that's what he chooses to do. Firestarter. Charlie McGee's father. Every time he used the push, he would get nosebleeds, and there was this idea that he would have hemorrhages from using his power. So the idea of people having power that will eventually kill them if used inappropriately or if used too much is something, again, that Stephen King sort of carries along in his writings beyond Carrie. But all of this stuff is starting here. And then there's the idea of the evil children, right? Like Stephen King loved to write stories that involved children and then bad things happening around them or by them, right? Carrie was just the first of many evil child stories that King would put out. Salem's Lot, you got Danny Glick, evil vampire children, Danny Torrance in The Shining, Christine with its teenage protagonists, Charlie McGee and Firestarter. So many stories about children and supernatural horror happening to the children. And this all, of course, finally culminates in the ultimate book about children and supernatural horror, which is It. And It was the last book that Stephen King wrote that involved children and supernatural horror. Many people, including myself, consider that his magnum opus. And that all started with Carrie. Carrie, he started with a child, a teenager, doing with powers and having evil things done to them, and then he went on with that, and he made some really good and wonderful stories on that sort of idea of what's happened. And the last thing I want to talk about is people always ask, especially new people, when they get into Stephen King for the first time, and they start to get into King, they start to read The Tower, and they start to see the connections. They start to say, do all King books connect to The Tower? Do all King books connect to The Tower? So somebody is going to ask, does Carrie connect to The Tower? Is there a Tower connection in Carrie? Overtly, no. However, if you'll indulge me for just a moment, if you want to make a nebulous reach for it, I present to you this idea. This is my idea of the Carrie Tower connection. Stephen King, when you get into the Tower, talks a lot about, especially towards the end, right? When you get into Gan, the stories of Gan, and stories of the Crimson King, talks a lot about the ideas of good and evil, light versus dark, order versus chaos, Gan versus the Crimson King, how Gan brings order, King brings chaos. And he talks a lot about, in the Tower, this idea of what he calls the coming of the White. And the coming of the White is usually Gan or agents of Gan who are coming in to bring light to the darkness, or is coming in to bring evil down, or to bring order back to chaos, right? It's the triumph of good, which is the white, over evil, which is black, right? King very much deals in binaries in a lot of these books. So, thematically, one could say, and again, this is a stretch, but I will leave this to your mind if you want to go this route or not. So one could say in Carrie was the very first instance of the coming of the White. An anti-hero who is bringing fire to the darkness, light to the dark, who was the force of good, because again, Carrie was not a monster. Carrie was an anti-hero. Everybody around Carrie that was indulging in their behavior were the monsters. Carrie was bringing judgment to the evil. So in a thematic way, you could say that Carrie started the theme of the coming of the White that then follows through most of every King book ever written, right? King's really big on that. Good versus evil, black versus white, light versus dark, order versus chaos, balance. So in a roundabout way, in a thematic way, Carrie really started the ball rolling for all of it. For all of everything that came forth, we can thank Carrie and Tabitha for this, because Carrie was one of the books that Tabitha saved and told King, you need to write this because this is important. It was a hell of a debut, right? From a person who was known at that point only for writing short stories. I think it was a hell of a debut. I certainly enjoyed the book much more than I thought I would, because I had known the story, but I didn't know the story in this manner because I didn't get a lot of the backstory. You get the backstory in the book, the backstory of Carrie's mother and of Carrie and of the town and of the different people in it, so which you don't get in the movie. So I enjoyed the book a lot more than I thought I would. It was a hell of a debut novel. It launched a mega career. I don't think anybody at this time thought this was going to be the book that would just make Stephen King a household name. But here we are. And I was really glad that I read it. I can't believe I waited this long to read it, but we finally did. And I think it is, I think it is everything that everybody has held it up to be. It stands the test of time. It's hard to read because of the bullying. It can be hard to read because of the violence. But at the end, you root for Carrie. You feel bad for Carrie. You feel bad for someone who just wants to be left alone, who just wants to be involved, who just wants to be a normal person and just can't because nobody will let them. So it was a wonderful, wonderful novel. I gave it a 4 on Goodreads. If you haven't read Carrie, you should. If you don't own it, you should. Because I think that Carrie really is the cornerstone of his work. One of the cornerstones of his foundation. And I think it really is that good. So guys, here's my review of Stephen King's Carrie. Little late, but finally done. So guys, what'd you think? What do you think of Carrie? What do you think of Carrie as a novel? As a book? I mean, as a movie. As a movie, as a novel, as a debut novel. As the book that launched a career. Tell me what you think down below. Because I'd be eager to hear what everybody thinks about this. I still can't believe that Carrie is 50 years old. Next year will be the 50th anniversary of Salem's Lot. Next year. No, maybe in a couple of years. My years are a little off. But in a couple of years, at some point soon, Salem's Lot will be the 50th anniversary of that. Maybe we could do a review of that then again. So guys, there's my review of Carrie. Hope you enjoyed it. If you did, give it a thumbs up, give it a like, give it a subscribe, share it around, tell your friends, tell your enemies, tell people who have never read Carrie and should. And until next time, thank you for coming to my TED Talk, and I will see you in the next video.